and it's really a privilege to introduce our next keynote speaker, who is dynamic and has a wealth of experience. David Brown is a U.S. Army retired colonel. He is the executive director of the Advanced Strategic Program and director of the Center on Irregular Warfare and Armed Groups at the U.S. Naval War College. And I had the privilege of participating in an event at the U.S. Naval War College probably about 6 months ago, where I got to know David, and I can tell you he's an incredible speaker, and the things that he will touch upon, I believe, will be really germane to today's subject. He's a decorated combat veteran and former Army strategist. He holds advanced degrees from the Army School of Advanced Military Studies and Long Island University and the Naval War College. His military career spanned over 30 years of combat arms units experience in a variety of command and staff positions for the United States and overseas. At the War College, Professor Brown taught in the Strategy and Policy Department and in the Maritime Advanced Warfighting School. Ladies and gentlemen, he's going to talk to us today about a storm advisory, a dangerous seas and the weaponization of everything. Please welcome David Brown. Thank you. Good luck.
All right, well, good afternoon. I think I'm the only thing holding you up from lunch. So hopefully we'll take a few minutes to think about some of this. Hopefully you'll find some of this interesting. Thank you, Daniel, for that introduction. I have an obligatory caveat that whatever I'm going to say is these views are my own. They're not necessarily the views of the Department of Defense, the U.S. Navy, or the U.S. Naval War College. So, I was thinking back, many, many years ago when I was a young officer on a large military base. I'd occasionally be assigned as the division staff duty officer. And what the division staff duty officer does is, after all the senior leaders go to bed for the evening and leave the office, you have this young officer who's basically left as the representative authority for the night. And what does every young staff duty officer pray for? A very quiet evening. That's what they pray for. But with 20, 30,000 soldiers in an enclosed base, that's hardly to be expected. But in fact, I think in looking at your industry, shippers, insurers, global commodity traders, they pray and wish for the same thing, right? They're praying for calm, smooth sailing, both literally and figuratively. And as much as I'd like to repeat to you today the traditional naval invocation of having fair winds and following seas, I'm afraid that my observations about the international security environment lead me instead to a storm advisory on the horizon. And like the ancient Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, I believe that we are living in a time of dangerous seas and an unprecedented period of social upheaval, political warfare, sweeping technological innovation, and the weaponization of everything. So just to put this in framing, just for some history of the last century in the 20th century was a time of social upheaval. Socialism, Nazism, fascism, communism. And it was a time of regional political earthquakes, a race for resources globally, rampant colonialism, the peak of European dreams of empire, and the dying spasm of those ambitions. There was also a time period of geopolitical rivalries, particularly in two arenas: the continental landmass of Eurasia, or Mackinder's World Island, and of course, the maritime remnants theory of the famous Yale scholar Nicholas Spikeman as what he called the great circumferential maritime highway of the world, which he said encircled the continent of Eurasia. And global commerce energy, food, commodities, and the oceans, provided and promoted economic and political openness and a certain amount of stability. And it ushered in what I would see as maybe gathering globalization in the last century, or maybe what you could call the great stitching together of the world, until the tensions of those social political titanic shifts resulted in 2 world wars, millions of dead, and in the second half century, a Cold War that was framed by bipolar nuclear deterrence. Well, I think looking at that history, much like today, a lot of those upheavals in the last century were ushered in by massive technological change. Consider, for instance, the advent of nitrogen fertilizer, perhaps one of the single most impactful technological advances in the last couple of centuries. Why? Because it set the stage for massive population growths due to agricultural yields, and it also resulted in and set the stage for massive death because of the use of high nitrogen fertilizer and high explosives. And this one technological advancement resulted in one of the bloodiest centuries in history. But in addition to the previous century's technological advancements like rail and telegraph, the last century saw a literal industrialization of mass conflict: wireless, machine guns, indirect artillery, armor, air power, missiles, submarines, and nuclear and hydrogen weapons. And so we saw innovations in transport, agriculture, and this larger arc of industrialized killing. And by the close of the century, we saw also electronic cybernetic domains that increasingly computerized the world, stitching it further together. And we had the advent of the internet, mobile communications, and of course, from a security standpoint, precise strike capabilities. So what does all that have to do with today? And I guess I just wanted to lay that as a backdrop. But my argument and my thesis for today is that we are living also in our own unprecedented period of social upheaval, political warfare, sweeping technological innovations, and what I might call, or what other people have called, the weaponization of everything. We are living in what some have described as a second Cold War. Flashpoints with Taiwan, the South China Sea, North Korea, Iran, the Houthis in the Red Sea, and their impact at global maritime shipping in the last 2 years. Geopolitical rivalries remain rampant. And if you look at the areas of Ukraine, Gaza, and also the revisionist powers, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and even the Arctic as a potential zone of coming conflict. And we still see that seaboard trade is still dependent not only on the larger seas, but on the inner seas, the Mediterranean, the South and East China Sea, the Straits, Bab el-Mandeb, Hormuz, Taiwan, and maybe the Arctic as well, if you look at some of the narrow seas, all of which are subject to regional hegemonic concerns. And if you don't see the rise of political warfare, you're obviously not watching the news at night, and or even scanning the headlines. And this is not an earthquake. I think it is clearly more of a tsunami. Migrations, deportations, concern over other maritime choke points, some of which I've already mentioned: Hormuz, Suez, Taiwan, Panama. And so I think that even the ideas in our own government of doing away with FEMA or killing USAID, tariffs, protectionism, populist nationalism, and these movements that are not stitching the world together, but instead they are splintering the power structures of the world and dividing the world into regional armed camps. And I think along with the previous century, and maybe even more so, we are seeing an immense increase in technological innovation and growth. If you talk about information for just a minute, someone wrote in the mid-'80s this idea about knowledge doubling, whether it's knowledge in general or scientific knowledge, and they posited that from the year of 81 until, how long, whatever the knowledge of the world was at that time period, how long did it take to double? And the other people have looked at this as well, and the idea was that it took about 1,750 years to 1750 for the knowledge of the world to double. Doubled again in 200 years through 1950. It doubled again in 10 years. By 2010, it is doubling every 5 years, and by 2014, it had been doubling every 2 years. And it was predicted by 2020 that digital data would reach something on the order in the world created and being used of something on the order of 44 zettabytes. Now, a zettabyte is a 1 with 21 zeros behind it. Almost unimaginable numbers. 2 years ago, it was estimated by this year in 2025 that the world would create and consume 181 zettabytes. And today, the figures are that we are currently creating and using something on the order of 402 million terabytes of data a day. And by 2028, that growth curve is going to reach up to nearly 400 zettabytes, which is nearly unimaginable. And so I'd make the argument in some ways that information and the mining of data is the new mineral in the world. But in addition to information, we have technological innovation in markets, in the financial system, in and sources of energy, in manufacturing, in materials, in medical and biosciences, and in space. And of course, when you're talking about security, many technologies, almost every technology has been weaponized to some degree, and we're going to see the weaponization of a number of security-related technologies. Things, and the most important pieces of those are probably advanced AI, quantum computing, robotics, miniaturization, including nanotechnologies, increased processing speed, big data, 3D printing, ubiquitous ISR, energy storage, direct energy weapons, drone warfare, hypersonics, autonomous weapons, and even human enhancement. In fact, we are seeing what one writer has actually called the weaponization of not only these technologies, but the weaponization of everything. And what that means is that where some non-kinetic tools, not just military tools, become more disruptive to societies than even military force. We're entering a global competition that's constant, hyper-networked, cybernetic, algorithmically accelerated, data-driven, and full of disinformation that shortly we will not be able to tell whether it is true or not. We are weaponizing energy, currency markets, and we are seeing conflict across spectrums that are ill-defined, irregular in their patterns, including social networks and media. And this weaponization of everything would include continuation of conflict that's not limited to military engagement, but includes propaganda, cyber operations, economic pressure, and often deployed below a threshold of kinetic violence and traditional war. These nebulous, what some people have called as gray areas, are just short of overt aggression, and they make attribution and response extraordinarily difficult. Also, modern technology, as part of the internet and social media, has amplified potential disinformation and the manipulation of public opinion, and it blurs the lines of conflict in everyday life. The truth is that we are now under siege, not kinetically, but on intangible battlefields, and this is now a defining feature of both domestic and global security environments. In conclusion, I believe that we are currently living in a tremendous period of social upheaval, political warfare, sweeping technological innovation, and the weaponization of hyper, accelerated, networked cyber conflict, social media data, among many other items. Welcome to the era of persistent global conflict. Today, I'd give a storm advisory. There are dangerous and rising seas ahead for all of us. Thank you very much for your time, and if we have a few minutes, I'd be welcome to take questions. Or is everyone hungry?
My question has to do with what the recent actions have been taken by the Russians, their commercial fleets in the Baltic, cutting fiber optic cables of our NATO allies in Denmark and Finland and in Sweden and Norway. What do you think is the appropriate response to these actions by the U.S. and NATO, and do you consider them kinetic events, or how you say the under the threshold kind of?
I would say that those are non-kinetic events in the fact that they're kind of under the threshold of what a country's willing to do that would not produce a kinetic response from the United States or one of our allies. I do think that there is more joint, not only attribution, but also working together to try to do this. I think Finland has just taken on a couple of, it's kind of like the Dark Fleet or the Shattered Fleet that was being talked about a few minutes ago. There's more, I think, a little bit more intentionality for NATO or for groups of countries or for countries to act unilaterally to seize these ships or to sanction the countries involved. But the act of sabotage is exactly that. And there's no denying that we know who's doing some of this and that it is a response to either produce political warfare or produce instability in those regions. Sir.
Thanks. Very fascinating presentation, and it's certainly a lot on our minds these days, the conflict among the great powers, right? So you described a lot of these weaponizations. At what point do they lead to a hot war? I mean, how far do they have to take it before we actually take serious military action?
Well, I think that, everybody, when we talk about deterrence, we're hoping in some way, there's two types of deterrence. You have deterrence by punishment, you have deterrence by denial. Deterrence by denial means that we want someone to doubt psychologically whether or not they can pull off what it is they're thinking about. We hope that Xi wakes up every morning, looks across Taiwan Strait, and feels like, or has military planners that come in and tell him, I'm not sure we can get there. With the transports we have, we can't move it in one era. The problem with, that a lot of these countries are trying very, very hard, though, to stay under these thresholds that would initiate a great power war. There's nothing more destructive than great power war. You look in the last century, what killed millions of people were mostly great power conflict. I think that there are some major touchstones. Taiwan is one of them. I don't believe that they can pull that off in one transport load in order to put as much force as they would need to on Taiwan. And so I think at the moment they are deterred in terms of their belief of whether or not they can pull that operation off. It's not like walking across the border in Ukraine. That was hard enough. It's 100 miles of ocean. Having said that, there are other touch points around the world, and the history of war would tell you that great power war has started by being dragged into it by lower level conflicts. And so if you look at the Pakistan-India border, or you look at Iran, or you look at any other number of touchstones, if you have third-party intervention, this could certainly lead to great power war. But the most important thing for both the U.S. government, Department of Defense, and our allies is to prevent that outcome.
It's quite a meal full of ideas, but let's just say you're a simple ship owner running 30 ships, tankers, or bulk carriers around the world. What are you supposed to do about it with your organization?
Well, obviously, there's a lot of people in this room that do their own risk management, risk analysis. Insurers, I'm sure, do. A lot of shippers, decided to avoid the Red Sea. Although Russian tankers are still using it a little bit. And so I think that, there's an attribute of watching the world as it transforms and takes place. Those in this industry, 80% of the world's goods probably still carried by seaborne trade. And the maritime powers of the world have always been the richest powers of the world, and they've had a view of strategic outlook that has been informed by prosperity that came from oceanic global trade. But I'd say if you're a shipper, just like anyone else, the world is going to devolve into an even more dangerous place than it is today in the next several decades. All right, well, I think it's about lunchtime, and thank you very much for your kind attention.
All right, what a great morning. Thank you, Colonel. Please enjoy the pre-luncheon reception sponsored by the Liberian Registry, and then lunch sponsored by the American Club.